Section 2. A Misunderstanding About Method. Before I go any further with this sketch, I find I must pause upon a parenthesis touching the nature of my task, without which the rest of it may be misunderstood. As a matter of fact, without pretending to any official or commercial experience, I am here doing a great deal more than has ever been asked of most of the mere men of letters, if I may call myself, for the moment, a man of letters, when they confidently conducted social movements or set up social ideals. I will promise that by the end of these notes, the reader shall know a great deal more about how men might set about making a distributive state than the reader of Carlyle ever knew about how they should set about finding a hero king or a real superior. I think we can explain how to make a small shop or a small farm a common feature of our society better than Matthew Arnold explained how to make the state the organ of our best self. I think the farm will be marked on some sort of rude map more clearly than the earthly paradise on the navigation chart of William Morris. And I think, in comparison with his News from Nowhere, this might fairly be called News from Somewhere. Rousseau and Ruskin were often much more vague and visionary than I am, though Rousseau was even more rigid in abstractions, and Ruskin was sometimes very much excited about particular details. I need not say that I am not comparing myself to these great men. I am only pointing out that even from these whose minds dominated so much wider a field, and whose position as publicists was much more respected and responsible, nothing was a matter of fact asked beyond the general principles we are accused of giving. I am merely pointing out that the task has fallen to a very minor poet when these very major prophets were not required to carry out and complete the fulfillment of their own prophecies. It would seem that our fathers did not think it quite so futile to have a clear vision of the goals with or without a detailed map of the road, or to be able to describe a scandal without going on to describe a substitute. Anyhow, for whatever reason, it is quite certain that if I really were great enough to deserve the reproaches of the utilitarians, if I really were as merely idealistic or imaginative as they make me out, if I really did confine myself to describing a direction without exactly measuring a road, to pointing towards home or heaven and telling men to use their own good sense in getting there, if this were really all that I could do, it would be all that men immeasurably greater than I am were ever expected to do, from Plato and Isaiah to Emerson and Tolstoy. But it is not all that I can do, even though those who did not do it did so much more. I can do something else as well, but I can only do it if it be understood what I am doing. At the same time, I am well aware that, in explaining the improvement of so elaborate a society, a man may often find it very difficult to explain exactly what he is doing until it is done. I have considered and rejected half a dozen ways of approaching the problem, by different roads that all lead to the same truth. I had thought of beginning with the simple example of the peasant, and then I knew that 100 correspondents would leap upon me, accusing me of trying to turn all of them into peasants. I thought of beginning with describing a decent distributive state in being, with all its balances of different things, just as the socialists describe their utopia in being, with its concentration in one thing. Then I knew 100 correspondents would call me utopian, and say it was obvious my scheme could not work because it could only describe it when it was working. But what they would really mean by my being utopian would be this: that until the scheme was working, there was no work to be done. I have finally decided to approach the social solution in this fashion, to point out first that the monopolist momentum is not irresistible, that even here and now much could be done to modify it, much by anybody, almost everything by everybody. Then I would maintain that on the removal of that particular plutocratic pressure, the appetite and appreciation of natural property would revive, like any other natural thing. Then, I say, it will be worthwhile to propound to people thus returning to sanity, however sporadically, a sane society that could balance property and control machinery. With the description of that ultimate society, with its laws and limitations, I would conclude. Now, that may or may not be a good arrangement or order of ideas, but it is an intelligible one, and I submit with all humility that I have a right to arrange my explanations in that order, and no critic has a right to complain that I do not disarrange them in order to answer questions out of their order. I am willing to write him a whole encyclopedia of distributism, if he has the patience to read it. It is unreasonable for him to complain that I have not dealt adequately with zoology, state provision for, under the letter B, or described the honourable social status of the Guild of the Xylographers, while I am still dealing alphabetically with the Guild of Architects. I am willing to be as much of a bore as Euclid, but the critic must not complain that the 48th proposition of the second book is not a part of the Pons Essenorum. The ancient guild of bridge builders will have to build many such bridges. Now, from comments that have come my way, I gather that the suggestions I have already made may not altogether explain their own place and purpose in this scheme. I am merely pointing out that monopoly is not omnipotent even now and here, and that anybody could think, on the spur of the moment, of many ways in which its final triumph can be delayed and perhaps defeated. Suppose a monopolist, who is my mortal enemy, endeavours to ruin me by preventing me from selling eggs to my neighbours. I can tell him I shall live on my own turnips in my own kitchen garden. I do not mean to tie myself to turnips, or swear never to touch my own potatoes or beans. I mean the turnips as an example, something to throw at him. Suppose the wicked millionaire in question comes and grins over my garden wall and says, "I perceive by your starved and emaciated appearance that you are in immediate need of a few shillings, but you can't possibly get them." I may possibly be stung into retorting, "Yes, I can. I could sell my first edition of Martin Chuzzlewit." I do not necessarily mean that I see myself already in a pauper's grave unless I can sell Martin Chuzzlewit. I do not mean that I have nothing else to suggest except selling Martin Chuzzlewit. I do not mean to brag like any common politician that I have nailed my colours to the Martin Chuzzlewit policy. I mean to tell the offensive pessimist that I am not at the end of my resources, that I can sell a book, or even, if the case grows desperate, write a book. I could do a great many things before I came to definitely anti-social action like robbing a bank, or, worse still, working in a bank. I could do a great many things, of a great many kinds, and I give an example at the start to suggest that there are many more of them, not that there are no more of them. There are a great many things of a great many kinds in my house, besides the copy of Martin Chuzzlewit. Not many of them are of great value, except to me, but some of them are of some value to anybody. For the whole point of a home is that it is a hotchpotch, and mine, at any rate, rises to that austere domestic ideal. The whole point of one's own house is that it is not only a number of totally different things, which are nevertheless one thing, but it is one in which we still value even the things that we forget. If a man has burnt my house to a heap of ashes, I am none the less justly indignant with him for having burnt everything, because I cannot at first even remember everything he has burnt. And as it is with the household goods, so it is with the whole of that household religion, or what remains of it, to offer resistance to the destructive discipline of industrial capitalism. In a simpler society, I should rush out of the ruins, calling for help on the commune or the king, and crying out, "Hurrah! A robber has burnt my house!" I might, of course, rush down the street, crying in one passionate breath, "Hurrah! A robber has burnt my front door of seasoned oak, with the usual fittings, 14 window frames, 9 curtains, 5½ carpets, 753 books, of which 4 were editions deluxe, 1 portrait of my great-grandmother," and so on through all the items, but something would be lost of the fierce and simple feudal cry. And in the same way, I could have begun this outline with an inventory of all the alterations I should like to see in the laws, with the object of establishing some economic justice in England. But I doubt whether the reader would have had any better idea of what I was ultimately driving at, and it would not have been the approach by which I propose at present to drive. I shall have occasion later to go into some slight detail about these things, but the cases I give are merely illustrations of my first general thesis, that we are not even at the moment doing everything that could be done to resist the rush of monopoly, and that when people talk as if nothing could now be done, that statement is false at the start, and that all sorts of answers to it will immediately occur to the mind. Capitalism is breaking up, and in one sense we do not pretend to be sorry it is breaking up. Indeed, we might put our own point pretty correctly by saying that we would help it to break up, but we do not want it merely to break down. But the first fact to realize is precisely that it is breaking up and it's breaking down. It is a choice between its being voluntarily resolved into its real component parts, each taking back its own, and its merely collapsing on our heads in a crash or confusion of all its component parts, which some call communism and some call chaos. The former is the one thing all sensible people should try to procure. The latter is the one thing that all sensible people should try to prevent. That is why they are so often classed together. I have mainly confined myself to answering what I have always found to be the first question. What are we to do now? To that I answer, what we must do now is to stop the other people from doing what they are doing now. The initiative is with the enemy. It is he who is already doing things, and will have done them long before we can begin to do anything, since he has the money, the machinery, the rather mechanical majority, and other things, which we have first to gain and then to use. He has nearly completed a monopolist conquest, but not quite, and he can still be hampered and halted. The world has woken up very late, but that is not our fault. That is the fault of all the fools who told us for 20 years that there could never be any trusts, and are now telling us equally wisely that there can never be anything else. There are other things I ask the reader to bear in mind. The first is that this outline is only an outline, though one that can hardly avoid some curves and loops. I do not profess to dispose of all the obstacles that might arise in this question, because so many of them would seem to many to be quite a different question. I will give one example of what I mean. What would the critical reader have thought if at the very beginning of this sketch I had gone off into a long disputation about the law of libel? Yet, if I was strictly practical, I should find that one of the most practical obstacles. It is the present ridiculous position that monopoly is not resisted as a social force, but can still be resented as a legal imputation. If you try to stop a man cornering milk, the first thing that happens will be a smashing libel action for calling it a corner. It is manifestly mere common sense that if the thing is not a sin, it is not a slander. As things stand, there is no punishment for the man who does it, but there is a punishment for the man who discovers it. I do not deal here, though I am quite prepared to deal elsewhere, with all these detailed difficulties which a society as now constituted would raise against such a society as we want to constitute. If it were constituted on the principles I suggest, those details would be dealt with on those principles as they arose. For instance, it would put an end to the nonsense whereby men who are more powerful than emperors pretend to be private tradesmen suffering from private malice. It will assert that those who are in practice public men must be criticized as potential public evils. It would destroy the absurdity by which an important case is tried by a special jury, or, in other words, that any serious issue between rich and poor is tried by the rich. But the readers will see that I cannot here rule out all the 10,000 things that might trip us up. I might assume that the people ready to take the larger risks would also take the smaller ones. Now, this outline is an outline. In other words, it is a design, and anybody who thinks we can have practical things without theoretical designs can go and quarrel with the nearest engineer or architect for drawing thin lines on thin paper. But there is another and more special sense in which my suggestion is an outline, in the sense that it is deliberately drawn as a large limitation within which there are many varieties. I have long been acquainted, and not a little amused, with the sort of practical men who will certainly say that I generalize because there is no practical plan. The truth is that I generalize because there are so many practical plans. I myself know 4 or 5 schemes that have been drawn up more or less drastically for the diffusion of capital. The most cautious, from a capitalist standpoint, is the gradual extension of profit-sharing. A more stringently democratic form of the same thing is the management of every business, if it cannot be a small business, by a guild or group clubbing their contributions and dividing their results. Some distributists dislike the idea of the workman having shares only where he has work. They think he would be more independent if his little capital were invested elsewhere, but they all agree that he ought to have the capital to invest. Others continue to call themselves distributists because they would give every citizen a dividend out of a much larger national system of production. I deliberately draw out my general principles so as to cover as much as possible of these alternative business schemes. But I object to being told that I am covering so many because I know there are none. If I tell a man he is too luxurious and extravagant, and that he ought to economize in something, I am not bound to give him a list of his luxuries. The point is that he will be all the better for cutting down any of his luxuries, and my point is that modern society would be all the better for cutting up property by any of these processes. This does not mean that I have not my own favourite form. Personally, I prefer the second type of division given in the above list of examples. But my main business is to point out that any reversal of the rush to concentrate property will be an improvement on the present state of things. If I tell a man his house is burning down in Putney, he may thank me, even if I do not give him a list of all the vehicles which go to Putney, with the numbers of all the taxicabs and the timetable of all the trams. It is enough that I know that there are a great many vehicles for him to choose from, before he is reduced to the proverbial adventure of going to Putney on a pig. It is enough that any one of those vehicles is on the whole less uncomfortable than a house on fire, or even a heap of ashes. I admit I might be called unpractical if impenetrable forests and destructive floods lay between here and Putney. It might then be as merely idealistic to praise Putney as to praise paradise. But I do not admit that I am unpractical because I know there are half a dozen practical ways which are more practical than the present state of things. But it does not follow, in fact, that I do not know how to get to Putney. Here, for instance, are half a dozen things which would help the process of distributism, apart from those on which I shall have occasion to touch as points of principle. Not all distributists would agree with all of them, but all would agree that they are in the direction of distributism. 1. The taxation of contracts so as to discourage the sale of small property to big proprietors and encourage the break-up of big property among small proprietors. 2. Something like the Napoleonic testamentary law and the destruction of primogeniture. 3. The establishment of free law for the poor, so that small property could always be defended against great. 4. The deliberate protection of certain experiments in small property, if necessary by tariffs and even local tariffs. 5. Subsidies to foster the starting of such experiments. 6. A league of voluntary dedication, and any number of other things of the same kind. But I have inserted this chapter here in order to explain that this is a sketch of the first principles of distributism, and not of the last details, about which even distributists might dispute. In such a statement, examples are given as examples, and not as exact and exhaustive lists of all the cases covered by the rule. If this elementary principle of exposition be not understood, I must be content to be called an unpractical person by that sort of practical man. And indeed, in his sense, there is something in his accusation. Whether or no I am a practical man, I am not what is called a practical politician, which means a professional politician. I can claim no part in the glory of having brought our country to its present promising and hopeful condition. Harder heads than mine have established the present prosperity of coal. Men of action, of a more rugged energy, have brought us to the comfortable condition of living on our capital. I have had no part in the great industrial revolution which has increased the beauties of nature and reconciled the classes of society. Nor must the too enthusiastic reader think of thanking me for this more enlightened England, in which the employee is living on a dole from the state, and the employer on an overdraft at the bank.